A growing number of people say they are feeling burned out after day of virtual meetings, calling it Zoom fatigue. A recent study published by Stanford University found that women experience significantly higher levels of that stress than men. About 14% of women in the study reported feeling very or extremely fatigued after video meetings, as compared to about 5.5% of men. CBS News reporter Kate Smith has been following how the pandemic has adversely impacted women. She says Zoom fatigue is just one of many factors. And Kate joins us now from New York City. So, Kate, can you go deeper into what Zoom fatigue is and the symptoms associated with it?
Lana, Zoom fatigue, I think, is the corporate jargon of 2020. It's basically a catch-all term to describe that feeling of fatigue, exhaustion, after a day of video conferencing, be it on Zoom or Google Meets or, pick your poison. And the idea is that unlike, a day full of in-person meetings, there's a new and kind of unique feeling associated with a day of virtual meetings. And it's exhaustion, it's fatigue, and it's also a little bit of anxiety. But what we're hearing, and especially in this study that we looked at, is it's something that's completely new, and it's a new phenomenon as so much of the world has now adjusted to a work from home scenario where the vast majority of meetings are now virtual.
So talk to us about why it seems that women are experiencing this Zoom fatigue at higher levels than men, since it seems like everybody is on Zoom all the time. Why is it affecting women more?
So when I spoke to the author, one of the authors of this study, I should say, she identified 3 different reasons why these researchers behind this study felt that maybe women were feeling this more. And the first was a phenomenon called mirror anxiety. Now, what that is, it's the anxiety that comes from kind of the self-view on a video conference. So when you're, I'm sure many of our viewers have experienced this themselves when you're on Zoom or FaceTiming, you'll see the person that you're talking to, but then you'll also see a small icon of yourself. Now, of course, that's unusual. In an in-person meeting, you wouldn't be seeing a reflection of yourself the entire time. And what researchers say is that's what happens here is called something mirror anxiety. And what that does is they've found that among certain people, constantly seeing a reflection of themselves can unfortunately trigger feelings of depression, of anxiety, and of self-consciousness. And what we've found is that those negative feelings associated with mirror anxiety are often felt much more in women than they are in men. Now, that was one of the reasons. Another reason was this idea of being stared at. Now, think about an in-person meeting. There's one person presenting, and everyone's looking at that one person. Now, with Zoom, it's very different because it doesn't matter if you're presenting, if you're speaking, or if you're just a participant. It feels as if everyone is staring at you the entire time. And for obvious reasons, that can be anxiety-inducing. Even though everyone isn't really staring at you, the feeling that people are has caused anxiety, and that's especially among women. Now, the third reason, Lana, is the idea that you feel physically trapped. Now, when you're in a meeting, again, nobody's really looking at you unless you're presenting, but the idea is that you can, if you have to go to the bathroom, you can get up. If you want to get a glass of water, if you need to check your phone, something like that, you can move around a little. But with the way that Zoom meetings are set up, you're very close to the camera, and your face is in the entire box, so if you move, it's very disruptive, right? You can kind of get out of the box very quickly. And for what women say, Lana, is that they can feel physically trapped when they're in this box. So it's those 3 different reasons why women were seeing self-report those much higher levels of anxiety and fatigue after a day long of video conferencing.
So, Kate, what are some of the solutions to it? Let's start with what employers can do to combat the problem.
So employers can stop scheduling Zoom meetings, right? It's as simple as that. And what we've seen is among some, larger corporations, we've seen a response to this because, of course, this Zoom fatigue is part of this larger culture of burnout right now. And after 13 months in lockdown, what you're seeing is that workers from home, they're saying they are exhausted. They're working longer hours, their productivity has dropped, their expectations are higher, and their physical interactions with people are obviously extremely limited if they're happening at all. So the Zoom fatigue, if you will, put that part of a much larger trend of burnout that's happening in the corporate world. And what employers can do, from what the researchers said, is they can, really limit the number of meetings. And what you're seeing some do is create days in which you can't actually schedule Zoom meetings. So take Citibank, for example. They declared Zoom-free Fridays. The idea is that anyone is prohibited from scheduling a Zoom meeting on Friday. And when I spoke to the research, they said this is particularly optimistic to them because in all the different things that you can do to battle Zoom fatigue, the number one thing, and I should say by far the number one thing, comes from employers. Employers recognizing that this is a real problem and one that they really need to focus on and combat.
What about individuals? What can we all do to deal with Zoom fatigue?
All right, so if your employer is not, as being as cooperative, they offered a few different ideas. And if you go down, think about it. So the mirror anxiety issue, you can turn off the self-view in Zoom. That's a feature that not many people know exists. So you can just turn that off so you don't have to see a reflection of yourself the entire time you're on a meeting. The second thing you can do, think about the idea of feeling physically trapped. Well, what you can do is you can either get a standing desk, is what one of the researchers told me. She actually said she was feeling a lot of Zoom anxiety, and having a standing desk actually helped quite a bit. So having a standing desk can help, but it's the idea of creating as much space as you possibly can between yourself and the camera. Now what that does is it creates a view where your face is less in view as possible, right? So if you move, it goes from right to left, it won't be as disruptive, and it kind of mimics the idea of a real meeting as much as you can in person. But again, Lana, what these researchers are saying, the number one thing has to come from an employer culture where we're addressing this issue and dealing with it and scheduling fewer Zoom meetings.
All right. Yeah. Kate, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.